what Israel's detractors are saying is basically that the U.S. is giving out free money to Israel, and Israel's pulling the U.S. into wars all over the world.
It's precisely the opposite. It's not the U.S. funding Israel to go about being a cowboy, but rather in order to rein Israel in. If we have to fund our own, our own purchases, then let's fund our own purchases, but use this as an opportunity to remodel the cooperation in a way that is more mutual and more beneficial, but that also supports Israel's old new security doctrine.
I'm Doron Spielman. Welcome to True East. Today, we're tackling one of the most important questions out there: Israel's reliance on the U.S. military aid, and if this is leading Israel over a cliff. To answer this question, I'm joined by one of Israel's top national security experts, Dr. Rafael BenLevi. Dr. BenLevi is a senior fellow at the Misgav Research Institute. He's also the director of the Churchill National Security Program at the Argaman Institute, of which I am a graduate. And now a word from our sponsors. Friends, as we stand with Israel, I want to share a powerful way lives are being restored right now. Across the country, families in poverty, Holocaust survivors, and young adults carrying deep emotional trauma are in desperate need right now of comfort and support. There is one organization out there that is quietly answering that call every day. That organization is called Meir Panim. When someone walks into a Meir Panim soup kitchen, they hear, "How are you? What do you need?" It's the dignity and the human connection that changes those people's lives, especially for those battling loneliness or trauma. Meir Panim provides warm meals, food assistance, and a safe, home-like space where people feel seen and supported. This year's campaign is called Hitchadshut, renewal, and that's exactly what your support could bring: nourishment, stability, and hope. If you're looking for a meaningful way to bless Israel, I encourage you to stand with Meir Panim and visit them at meirpanim, meirpanim.org/help Israel, or click on the link in the description to give or to learn more. Dr. BenLevi, thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Doron, for inviting.
It's a pleasure. I feel like I'm speaking to the teacher that I learned from for all these years. And in fact, that brings us directly into the main topic. Because, Rafael, you have been really championing for years that Israel should open its eyes and understand both the costs and the benefits of Israel's reliance on U.S. foreign military aid. And I want to ask you a question. Now that there's discussion in Israel about what's taking place, when for you, after October 7th to the present day, did you first look and say, okay, that's it. That's the problem with the Israel-U.S. relationship if it doesn't change?
Right. So obviously, I think this is something that we could have put our finger on for years. And I'm not the first one to do it. Right. The idea that Israel is too overly dependent on the current model, which is the model of grants, where, of course, the United States gives Israel money that is essentially like coupons that then it buys and purchases military equipment from U.S. manufacturers. And so I personally, but as well, I can point to a number of senior people in the Israeli defense and foreign establishment over the decades that have pointed out the disadvantages for Israel of the current model. The only thing that's significantly changed over the last 2 years is that whereas previously the amount of people with this opinion saying that Israel should take the initiative to change this framework and stop taking the grants, that used to be a relatively a voice that was only on the margins, let's say. Whereas the mainstream would belittle that opinion and say, look, there's no way, we can't change it, we're stuck, we need the money. And so the conversation has shifted such that now there's a real discussion, and it's not marginal at all, to recognize and to suggest that maybe we need to change, maybe the time has come to rework, remodeled the current framework for defense, security, industrial cooperation between the countries, right? And none of this is to say that we want to disconnect from the United States, go look for alternative superpower supporters, Russia, China. No one's saying that, right? The idea is, though, that we need to move away from the current framework, which it's already a partnership. We have to say that, right? It's already a partnership. The United States gets lots of benefits out of the current framework. But having said that, it's still
technology.
Yeah, absolutely, and we can go over them and technology and proof of their systems, because we use their systems in combat functions. That all kinds of information that we feed back. There's lots of partnerships, elements of partnership, but it still is structured fundamentally as the United States giving grants and giving resources to Israel. Like there's no getting away from that, right? And so at the very least. Again, so what I think today is come clear to many more people across Israel's security establishment and leadership that we need to move away from this model and more toward and strengthen the elements of partnership of that are a lot more mutual, right? And so we have various ideas of how to do that, but I think that's really what's changed. Obviously, the specific issue that maybe drove this home for many people over the course of the war was the threats of the Biden administration and implementation of the Biden administration not to resupply Israel, especially in its munitions, because that's the type of equipment that we need in order on the day-to-day or week-to-week basis to continue the operations, and specifically in Gaza at the time, right? And so I think that sort of drove home the over-dependence of the current model. And, there's lots, maybe other elements that we could develop as well.
It's one thing I think for myself, for many other people, I think we need to unpack a few things. First of all, on the very basic level, what Israel's detractors are saying is basically that the U.S. is giving out free money to Israel, and Israel's pulling the U.S. into wars all over the world. That's what we hear from the Tucker Carlsons, from people on the MAGA right, people that are, not everyone, but if you want to go after Israel today, it's that Israel is pulling the U.S. into places that aren't its interests, and that the U.S. is funding Israel to basically be a cowboy in the Middle East. I would like you to kind of explain to our listeners, what is, in fact, the U.S. actually giving Israel? Is it giving us cash? Is this an allowance? Are we a schnorrer, which is what many people say, are we out kind of fundraising for cash to spend on our own?
Right. So really, if you look over the dynamic since the mid-1970s, when the actual grant model, when the current model was initiated, it's precisely the opposite. It's not the U.S. funding Israel to go about being a cowboy, but rather in order to rein Israel in. Right. Since the Yom Kippur War and the institutionalization of the current framework, it's essentially been sort of paying Israel or supporting Israel with greater resources in order to facilitate it to giving away to strategic territory under the context of territory for peace. It's really territory for aid in some ways, because the peace never happened. But in some ways it was, Israel. Stop taking initiative, restrain your actions and your tendency to be forward leaning and to preempt and to be more strategically offensive toward your enemies. Restrain yourself and pull back from those buffer zones that you've established. And in exchange for that, we will also help you, strengthen your security by giving you more resources and better airplanes and better technologies. At the same time, it's also to balance out the technologies and the platforms that the United States wanted to sell to Arab partners or states around the region. And in order to keep Israel slightly one up, in order to manage the balance of power, because also the United States understood that if it strengthened the Arab states, I'm talking the 1970s, 1980s,
Egypt in particular.
Egypt specifically, but also in the 1980s, Saudi Arabia, and the place, the region looked a little different at the time. The more they strengthened the Arab states and their capabilities, then there was a danger that then they would start another war with Israel. So in order to keep that balance of power, then they were also going to give Israel the resources in order to keep its balance one up above the Arab states. But quite the opposite, exactly. So this is essentially paying Israel to restrain itself, not to be a cowboy, right? That's maybe the first point. So the second point is, to your question, is what is the current framework? How does it work? So essentially, the FMF, foreign military funding or financing, is money that is given to Israel on the condition that it spends it in the United States. meaning by purchasing military equipment from American manufacturers, right? So, of course, the people that support the current framework, they always point out, and rightly so, that this is essentially American government subsidies to the American defense industry, right? But then they go and give the equipment to Israel. Why giving the money in the first place? Because Israel does get to choose what it spends the money on, what its priorities are, in a conversation, in coordination with administration, with Congress. But so that's why I said it's essentially like coupons. It is giving Israel the money, but it's not just handing over cash to Israel in any ways. There was historically a certain element of that, about a quarter of the money of that amount that was allowed to be converted to shekels in order to purchase equipment from Israeli manufacturers. And as of the current MOU which was signed in 2016,
memorandum of understanding,
which is the sort of understanding between the executive branches that is sets out the parameters of this aid. That MOU called out a gradual ending or phasing out of that quarter of the amount that was allowed to be transferred into shekels. Therefore, as of today, it's essentially zero, and all of the money is being spent to purchase American-made equipment. That's the basic framework, right? And that's how it functions. Now, there is a lot of other elements of the defense industrial cooperation between the countries that happen that are not necessarily part of this. But before I go into any details of those, I should also mention that a portion of the 3.8 billion a year, or 38 billion over the course of the 10 years, a half billion is given or specifically toward the ballistic missile defense. Mm-hmm. Okay, and that is a separate model, because that is, it's not just the Americans giving Israel money to buy from American manufacturers, but it's being funded in order to co-produce and co-develop ballistic missile defense.
So that's the beginning of this kind of partnership model, where it's not just the gift certificate, here, take this money, go to Macy's in the US and spend it, and we'll give you us jobs. It's actually co-R&D and mutual production.
Yeah, and mutual ownership of IP, of the intellectual property, after it's been developed by mainly by Israel. So yeah, that element of it is it's a different type of model in and of itself than the majority of the FMF money, right? And but even that, so that's obviously the direction, or a sort of the type of model that we should look into. But there's other ways of strengthening the elements of partnership in the overall framework as well.
Let's go back for a moment to where this all began. Okay, take us back in time. Where did the idea, again, people think that the founding of the state of Israel is based on U.S. military aid because they haven't read history, or they've been kind of sold the narrative, which it's not true. Right? I don't think U.S. military aid was at all involved in Israel at the very beginning of the state of Israel. I don't even think during the Six-Day War. Correct me if I'm wrong. When did the U.S. begin giving military aid and military support to Israel, and why?
Right. So, of course, yeah, you're right. During the founding, during Independence War, the U.S. was not giving a cent, not of aid and not of equipment. It was actually under a military boycott from the United States.
Right. There was an embargo, and Jews were loading weapons onto ships really illegally in the U.S. and sending them from Cuba or wherever else to try to get them.
Yeah, but America was not Israel's main arms supplier in any sense. In the Independence War, Jews had made deals in Czechoslovakia under the approval of Stalin for a very short but critical period during the Independence War that gave us our first airplanes and another also large amounts of the other parts of the army that were critical in fighting in winning the War of Independence. And the U.S. was politically supportive of Israel, of course, true, and recognized Israel, and there was certain elements of economic support, but there was no strategic military cooperation, definitely not aid.
So basically Stalin approved the first weapons for Israel during the founding of the state of Israel. The U.S. gave political support, but essentially embargoed Israel with weapons. That's a very, very important point.
Absolutely. Also weapons that Israel managed to sort of smuggle in under the British mandate in the last few years. And so that was what Israel was founded with. Because very, very, very quickly after that, even by the end of the Independence War, once Stalin realized that Israel was not going to be pro-Soviet, rather pro-Western, then it very quickly cut it off and switched to supporting the Arab states around Israel, and that's the main sort of that was a main characteristic of the relationship of the Soviet Union within this within the entire history of the Arab-Israeli conflict. The Soviets supported both the Arab states and specifically the Palestinian Liberation Organization, Yasser Arafat, and there was a very, very close collaboration between Palestinianism and Palestinian terror and Soviet and KGB. So that was sort of thrown away.
Just want to throw out, but you know, in the war, as we know, almost all the weapons that we faced with Hamas and Hezbollah were Russian-made weapons, right? The Kalashnikov and so many of the landmines, everything else.
Through today, right? Okay. So very quick. After that, though, we still didn't move to getting American weapons, but rather French weapons. Where the 1950s and 1960s, Israel's main supplier of weapons, aside from its own independent military industry, which it very quickly began to build, both for tanks and small weaponry and other technologies. Of course, it started its nuclear program, both with Israeli scientists and Jewish scientists, but with French support as well. And the French did this because during the 1950s, it had mutual enemies, right? Because it saw Nasserism, Pan-Arabism, also brought across to Algeria, right? As it was in war with that same bloc essentially. And so France had a reason under de Gaulle to support Israel against their mutual enemies, primarily Egypt. Right, and so it sold Israel its first, its biggest combat platforms, jet fighter airplane,
Mirage.
And those were what Israel used in the 1956 Sinai campaign and in the 1967 war as well, in the Six-Day War. The first turnaround of the Americans that began in the mid-1960s, that had agreed to sell Israel some missiles, but the real turnaround was after 1967, because France essentially boycotted Israel at the outset of the war. It fought with what it had, but then immediately afterward, its interest had changed, and it also shifted to support the Arab side. And so it's only in this period, during the War of Attrition, in between 1967 and 1973, and even more so after 1973, that the United States because of Israel's victory in 1967, again, because of its doctrine of preemption, right, and of conquering territory, right, that's what made Israel into a force to be reckoned with. The United States recognized Israel as an asset, as someone that it should be supporting and working with, that could help serve its interests in the broader context of the Cold War. Right, so that's when it really started selling Israel its first jet fighter squadrons and other various technologies that, from there, that's where it really started. And at first, though, in 1969, 1970, those were still, Israel was purchasing it at full price with favorable loan conditions and loan guarantees that the administration gave, but Israel was paying for it.
We were buying it. We were buying it. They were giving us good financing terms.
Yeah, exactly. And it was only after the Yom Kippur War, in the context of Nixon, Kissinger, and their diplomacy and their attempts to shift Egypt out of the Soviet camp and bring them into the American camp, and that also led them to want Israel to leave the Sinai desert and give it over to Egypt. Then the deal, this was when the current framework sort of arose, where, okay, Israel is being asked to make certain sacrifices on its security, on the territory that it was holding, and that it had very good reasons to want to continue to hold on to. The United States wanted to also begin funding and supplying Egypt because it wanted it to bring it into its camp. So the idea was Israel would make compromises, but it would also get help and assistance, especially at the time. Israel was still in dire straits economically, a totally different place where it is today, and it was in dire need of that funding and resources. So the deal was the United States would then give it grants instead of loans in order to build up its own military, and then allow this whole rearranging of the strategic triangle between Israel, Egypt, the United States, and Soviet Union.
So Israel's asked to give up the Sinai, which for people that don't understand is a buffer zone between us and who at the time was our largest enemy, meaning this was absolutely critical for our small country. So we give up the Sinai. Egypt doesn't give up anything. They get back to Sinai, and they're also getting military aid, and Israel's getting military aid.
Mm-hmm.
So this begins, you're saying, that process of getting money and giving up territory.
Yeah.
Today, since we've had peace with Egypt, so-called peace with Egypt, although we could that's a podcast unto itself. Do most people today consider that to be a good deal that we did this?
Well, I mean, looking back at the peace agreement with Egypt, for the most part, even though it was pretty controversial at the time, right? But today, people say, well, look, it's held. Right, and it's held for upwards of 40 years. So, and at the time, it took Israel's primary military threat out of the circle of active belligerency. Right, it's hard to say peace. It's not real. It's not a warm peace in any way of imagination. But it's sort of held. And again, we didn't just leave the Sinai. The part of the agreement is the demilitarization of the Sinai, which today needs to be enforced. And that
explain that for one moment, please.
Well, part of the deal was Israel would leave it, but the Sinai would be its buffer zone because Egypt was committed to demilitarizing, when he was not allowed to put or build up military bases or forces in the Sinai. Now, over time, that has sort of eroded to a certain extent. Most of it with Israel's permission, right, in order to fight off ISIS in the Sinai Desert and other reasons, but a lot more than I think should be, and a lot more than is currently necessary. And there's I think good reason to insist on that being reinforced, right? But for the most part, looking back again, I could make a case why maybe this was a bad idea, and we didn't have to give up as much as we did, but we didn't have to give up the whole territory, but. That would be the harder case to make. The easier case to make is, look, it was a sacrifice, but it was reasonable. We didn't need the whole territory. And as long as it was demilitarized, that was worth the goal of putting Egypt out of the circle of belligerency.
And getting the money.
Yeah, and of building up Israel's resources.
How much money was that for Israel at the time? We were a much smaller country.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I don't
percentage of GDP roughly.
So that we're talking between 10 and 20% of Israel's GDP, the value of the aid at the time, right, in the 1970s, right, and so yeah, that was a very significant boost to Israel's power, Israel's air force, and in the terms of just hard resources. Right, but it didn't end there. Sorry, they were, on the one hand, the Egyptian case, as I said, is a relatively easy case to say, well, maybe this wasn't such a bad deal. The other, there's two other periods in which the aid was significantly raised. Okay, and one of them is I'm sort of jumping to the 1990s. We could also talk about the 1980s, the V program, and all that. But I don't think there's a strong case to be made there. That's also it's a big historical.
Just one word. The Levi was
a project for Israel to develop its own jet fighter, which was mainly done on the basis of having American engine supplier, like the jet engines. Wasn't developing its own jet engine, just the rest of the airplane, and it was mainly being funded with those funds that the United States was given. And at some point, the decision was made to cut it under American pressure. The decision was made to cut the project and not go through with developing its own indigenous air jet fighter. And so this was controversial because at the time it seemed that the Americans were strong-arming Israel into not being independent and having its own jet fighter. And again, there was an element of that. On the other hand, the entire project was based on American funding in the first place. So it wasn't that Israel just went and started its own jet fighter and the Americans said, no, you can't do that, right? So we were using their resources to do it. And at some point, there was economic reasons for ending it is on Israel's side and pressure from the United States, and it was ended. So again, at the time, there was controversial, and there's an argument to be made, but I think it's the stronger argument is that, look, we weren't independent, we weren't doing this independently in the first place, so that's why I don't think it's such a big case. What I do think is a bigger deal is in 1999, okay? Ehud Barak is Prime Minister of Israel. And this was in the midst of the Oslo Accords. We were already in the the Oslo terror wave. But
In the midst of
Arafat,
it, by the way,
yeah,
people were dying
in the 1990s,
in
right?
buses left and right.
Yeah,
In Israel,
but
1,000
Arafat,
people died in a
and
few.
Arafat is still playing this game that he's the one that wants peace, and it's the Hamas and it's all these other terrorists that are, that he's not managing to rein in, and Barak says, look, I have a year or so, within 10 months, I'm going to both sign a peace agreement with Syria and withdraw from Lebanon in order to have a peace agreement with Syria, and I'm going to make a final offer, and we are going to get the end of the conflict deal with Arafat. Okay, and he goes to Bill Clinton and says, "Look, I want to do this. We're gonna have peace. It's gonna be great, but we are taking a lot of risks in order to do this, and I need you to raise the aid by something like 400%, meaning like raise it by multiplied by 4, right? And commit to sort of like a 10-year plan that was an MOU that would sort of outline a 10-year plan for significantly quadrupling the amount of aid."
Hey, wait, hold, this is unreal. It's like increase the dosage of the drug so that we will make these decisions and convince the Israeli public. Maybe that's a big test.
Again, every step of the way, I don't think it's not really an American president strong-arming Israel into this deal.
No, it's Barak.
Right? It's Barak.
Barak strong-arming the Israeli public, enticing the Israeli public, facilitating. Okay, that's
and of course Clinton and the Americans, going along with and also facilitating this from their own side. I think it just needs to be clear, what the dynamic was. I blame if there's anyone to blame, it's Israel's prime minister, as much as it is the United States, and it's going along with what Israel is going along with as well. But it is an inducement; it's a very significant one, right? And this was at the time what Barak's idea was. We need to strengthen us by getting more resources and getting more airplanes and getting more of all of the equipment and technology, but that's going to allow me to implement the strategy that I'm interested in, which is making very significant concessions to Arafat and also toward Syria by leaving the buffer zone in southern Lebanon, which when he was rebuffed by Assad and there was no peace agreement to have with Syria, well, he left the buffer zone unilaterally anyway.
Right, we left anyways.
Right, but that was essentially his deal to his proposal to Clinton, and that's what Clinton went for, and that's why they signed a new MOU that significantly raised the aid.
Was that the first MOU technically?
No, MOU is just any piece of paper between the governments can be called an MOU. The first MOU that I understand was in 1982, signed between the Begin and the Reagan administration on strategic cooperation. But it wasn't a commitment to a certain amount of FMF grants, right? But this was essentially at the time, up until then. Each time that the United States Congress was, implementing its budget, then there was a new sort of negotiations to be had. Okay, how much grants and how much are they going to fund Israel? And this was a way of sort of both locking it in and giving Israel a sort of 10-year outlook of knowing what to expect, and also to avoid a lot of the haggling and negotiations that it was having all the time. And so everyone saw it to be an advantage, but it was a very significant ask on the one hand from Barak. And it also led us further into this model of Israel accepting upon itself restraint and making concessions on the other end, and the U.S. building up its technology and its extent in an absolute terms of how many airplanes it has, sort of in exchange or to allow it to make those concessions in order to feel secure. Of course, as it turns out, this was a false sense of security. Right, but that was the equation. One more time, 2007, Olmert. Okay, and I understand the context, right? Israel had now left Gaza, right, 2 years prior, and Hamas had just taken over Gaza from the Palestinian Authority, right? And this is the second Bush administration. Condoleezza Rice wants Olmert to come to Annapolis and have this big conference with all of the regional states to again come to a final end of the conflict and and major concessions to Abbas. And Olmert's willing to make very significant concessions, but he does not want to do it in the context of a big international conference, but rather he wants to have, one-on-one, negotiations, because going to a big conference always raises the pressure on Israel to make concessions, right? Because it sort of allows all the other states to to bully Israel and say, look, you're the obstacle to peace here.
Wait, I just want to insert here that Olmert at this time, he had pledged to the Israeli public that Hamas would not take over Gaza, right? That was an absolute commitment by Olmert. Hamas then takes over Gaza. I don't know if the corruption trials were brewing at this point, but we're post the Second Lebanon War.
Right. And not just that, which is we're precisely after the release of the commission of the report investigating the failures of the Second Lebanon War.
Okay.
which was also put significant pressure on Olmert. Politically, Olmert was at a very low point.
Yeah, it
right?
blamed him, didn't it? It blamed the report, the Winograd.
It was very critical of Olmert and his government, and which the war had happened just a year before that, right? So he has the Winograd Commission report, and he has Hamas taking over Gaza, and now he wants to go and make significant concessions to Arafat. And so, how do they allow him to do this? So he and Bush and Rice and the rest of the team, they come to a decision. We are going to right now come out with the announcement that we have agreed to sign a new MOU to increase the aid one more time that we're giving, and this sort of props up Olmert's standing and gives him sort of like the credit to then follow through with Annapolis and making his very significant concessions. Right. And so this again, this is, and that's how we got the MOU up until the 2000s.
Unbelievable. It's like hiding in plain sight. I mean, there's no
right.
attempt.
I mean, in some ways, I guess I had to do my own research into, the various biographies and to sort of collect and come across some of this information. None of this is written into the MOU, right? It doesn't say in the MOU, and Israel accepts upon itself restraint. It's going to make all kinds of concessions to its enemies, right? But there's always a political context, right, for the decision to have it. And aid, even though, of course, the United States gets money benefits back from it, it's still a decision of the United States is deciding to give Israel a whole bunch of grants, right? And so there's always going to be a political constellation surrounding this and decisions that are made. And in this way, I think that the aid has sort of it's induced, facilitated, and gone hand in hand with Israel's, or the main elements that I think of the conceptia, right, of Israel's failed strategic conception that culminated in the current war. Right, one of them is, let's say, its loss of independence in its own munitions manufacturing, right? Because this is the same time, the 2000s, where Israel, instead of upholding its own sort of doctrine of, having its own manufacturers, at the very least for its own bombs, right? And instead of doing that, it just became a lot more comfortable. We got all this money now, right? And these resources, let's just buy off the shelf JDAMs from the United States. And you can see in like the lists, right? And this is the time where Israel's are one or thousands, another tens of thousands, another thousands. It goes significantly up, and it's the same time when Israel is drawing out and allowing its own production, its own production lines to go to the wayside and not continue to produce.
So right? Basically, is the Israeli manufacturing industry, internal military industry for bombs, bullets, guns, at this point, they're basically kind of rotting on the...
I mean, I wouldn't put it so significantly. It's not like Israel gave up all of its capabilities, but from a point where the Ministry of Defense has its own directive that Israel must hold a certain amount of production capacity, and the IDF needs to order from them in order to justify it economically. Those were, I've found in investigating this, Israel's comptroller, Office of the Comptroller, reports calling out the Ministry of Defense, saying, look, you have a directive that says we need to hold on to a certain amount of production lines, and you're not meeting it. And it's not there. And this is 2012, 2014, it says it again. Right? So
right to national security.
Yeah, as in contradiction to the Ministry of Defense's own directives to have its own independent production capacity to a certain level, to a certain extent. And again, it's not written in the MOU that Israel can manufacture its own munitions. It can, right? But it's the dynamic is such that if it's more comfortable to just purchase with aid money, because when you get aid money, then you obviously want to make sure you use it all, and and there's a certain dynamic. You're as a staff officer in the Israeli Air Force headquarters, you have to decide, how am I going to manage my budget, right? I'm going to pay things with shkalim, or I'm going to pay things and make sure I use up the certain, whatever the amount of aid money that we have, and what am I going to buy? And so there's always a sort of a slight pressure to outsource and buy more American. And that was sort of the dynamic. One more way that it sort of played into the failed strategic conception is because part of the conception is the idea that, yes, we will withdraw from territory, but we will use high-tech capabilities, both defensive capabilities, to protect ourselves. This was the case in both southern Lebanon and toward Gaza, right? And so we build fences, and we also rely on standoff, high precision weaponry to sort of hit Hamas here and there when we have our rounds of fighting.
So this is the small, smart army.
Yes, exactly.
Concept. So
yeah, small and smart, but not cheap. Right, but very expensive.
But like, what is Israel like practically on the ground? Does that mean we're releasing divisions and kind of retiring divisions and tanks? What's happening as a result of this?
Specifically, yes, we're definitely Israel over the course of the late 1990s, primarily 2000s, 2010s. Israel significantly reduced its order of battle, its number of tanks, its divisions on its ground forces, out of the understanding that it doesn't really need to go conquer territory, so it's not going to need these forces. We can sort of solve it all by using intelligence, defensive measures, and the Air Force and precision-guided munitions that we can use to pinpoint wherever it is the terrorists or their the targets that we need to go after. So and of course Iron Dome, right? And Iron Dome with all of the the tremendous positive effects of being able to protect the civilian population from indiscriminate rocket fire. It also allowed us to be complacent about allowing the terror army to grow, just across the street, and that's part of that. That was part of the, defensive measures that were extremely expensive, funded by the United States, U.S. largesse, but that also allowed Israel to sort of continue sitting on its thumbs and not make a more significant decision to bring, bring the conflict to a clear decision or to, insist that Hamas will not continue to rule Gaza. Same thing with Hezbollah, right? And of course the Second Lebanon War is the biggest example of this. That Israel, it did have some sort of small ground maneuver, but it was an afterthought, and it wasn't thought through. It definitely wasn't in order to take control of territory, right? It was the implementation of this new strategy of we're going to fight the war by use of Air Force and standoff weapons and intelligence, right? But as at the end of the day, as great as Iron Dome is, the other side is capable of making rockets faster than we can necessarily shoot them out of the air, and even if we can keep up with it, we're footing the bill, and it's a lot larger bill for us. It's like shooting a nail out of the sky with a diamond, right? So part of this equation again is having all these extra resources, right, that allow us to implement this strategy, right? Which at the end of the day, I think it's clear today that blew up in our faces.
October 7th. So if I understand from you, if I trace over the last 20 years, Israel is not only giving up territory for money. The idea is we'll give you money. It will increase your security industry, not your industry. It will give you great security devices, applications to develop so that you can keep these enemies at bay, even though you've given up the territorial buffer zone. That's basically the idea. And at the same time, Israeli military officers are being sent to Harvard, are being sent to U.S. military camps. And what are they learning there? Like, what is the U.S. If Ben-Gurion and I learned this from you, was about this kind of this very fast, decisive army that has the initiative in enemy territory. What are they learning in Harvard? Is it all tied together, Rafael? Like the conceptually?
Well, yeah, I definitely think so. Plus, the idea, the part of this conception that there won't be any more big ground wars, that was not just an Israeli conception. This was sort of ideas that were discussed in academic and national defense universities in Europe, in the United States, and obviously there was a mutual sort of strengthening dynamic between Israeli IDF brass that it was studying and their interlocutors, in Europe and the United States. I definitely think that there's something, there's truth to that. And there's ideas, again, that, if there's going to be no more ground wars, then, what's left? What's left is the stronger intelligence and high-tech capabilities.
Precision-guided missiles. And... Okay, so Israel woke up to this reality October 7th. These things partially led up to it. I think there's other factors. We underestimated our enemies and many other things. And Israel was not able to meet that challenge right away. We were overwhelmed. We now know that ground wars are a reality. We fought a ground war in Gaza against Hezbollah. We're in Syria. We didn't necessarily fight an entire ground war in Syria, but we're in Syria right now. We've had a lot of actions. Is the United States and maybe have they also woken up to the reality that they also may end up fighting a ground war, or are we alone with this understanding?
I don't think that seems to be their main threat that they see, as far as their military planners see. When you look at the global threats environment to the United States, or what types of wars they might be fighting, it might be to break a blockade on Taiwan. It might be to support other the Europeans in fighting a ground war. Of course, I think the United States, particularly the Trump administration, understands the necessity of having a large military across the different branches. But
which is new, right? This is a change.
Well, I mean, sort of a return, but I think that the main a concept for the Trump administration is that we need to focus our energies on the big fish, and we expect our partners in the different areas of the world to do more to handle the security of their own region. Right? So if anyone's going to be fighting the ground wars, it's everyone in their own specific regions, and not the United States coming in and fighting it for anyone else. This is and therefore the expectation from its partners, both in Europe and in East Asia, is to invest more and to build up your own militaries and your own capabilities so that you can do more for your own security. Now, I think this is this is just in time. This can go hand in hand with the shift in Israel's own strategic thinking. As you pointed out, we are holding buffer zones in southern Syria because we understand that we need to hold those buffer zones for our security, definitely until such time where a Syrian regime who is honestly stabilized and committed to peace, maybe there would be something to talk about. But I think it's very clear. Same thing, even in southern Lebanon, in the context of the very unstable ceasefire, Israel still insisted that it would hold on to certain strategic areas in order to prevent Hezbollah's rebuild up. We are insisting that there will be no more independent statelet of Hamas terror state in Gaza, and we'll see however that's implemented by one way or the other. But the Trump deal is committed to having no Hamas rule in Gaza. Right, so Israel, and we're still in a buffer zone over there. So I think in many ways Israel has sort of shifted back into Ben-Gurion's type of doctrine of preemption, of understanding that the importance of conquering territory, of decisively winning the different rounds of fighting, and not allowing sort of a round to be fought where we sort of left our enemies significantly standing, we didn't significantly change the balance of power. So I think this can go very well hand in hand with a United States who is interested in having their allies do more for their own security, right? Because as I outlined, the current model of funding, it's sort of we're going to give you more resources, but you have to sort of restrain yourself and give up on territory. Well, we can flip that, right? Don't give us the resources. We'll purchase equipment that we need. But we're also going to be more forward-leaning in maintaining our buffer zones and our security. Of course, in the long term, a strategy, this type of strategy, I believe, leads to more stability, right, and to less wars, right? Because when you allow your enemies to see that you are in retreat and you're weak, then that leads to more wars. When you're strong and projecting strength, that also works in the United States, in the Middle East, just as much as the U.S. wants to project strength. That will, over time, actually lead to stabilizing the region. And of course, if the stronger Israel acts to keep Iran and to keep Iran's, or let's say to turn around Iran's bid for regional hegemony, which has gone to great lengths to do that in the last 2 years, and of course it needs to continue that, then that will also work toward stabilizing the region in the long term. But this is all predicated on Israel being vigilant and Israel to continue to maintain a strong military across its branches and to act when it needs to act, and act forward-leaning preemptively, and not to retreat in order for pieces of paper, or for not even promises and unilateral withdrawals that gave up territory to terrorist organizations. So if part of this rearranging of the model means Israel should be taking less resources from the United States. I believe that now, compared to the 1970s, now the value, the financial value of the aid out of Israel's GDP, it's 0.7%, meaning less than 1% of Israel's GDP. If you look at it in terms of how much is it compared to Israel's own shekels budget, we're talking in between 2 and 3% of Israel's budget, less so in the last few years because we've sort of raised the budget in order to finance the war. So, of course, that's a hit. That's a significant amount of money. It's not the same. Israel's not in the same position that it was in the 1970s or the 1980s or in the 90s or anywhere it's been before. And that understanding that, okay, if we have to fund our own, our own purchases, then let's fund our own purchases and remake and also, but use this as an opportunity to remodel the cooperation in a way that is more mutual and more beneficial, but that also supports Israel's sort of shifted and, or its old new security doctrine.
So Israel needs to wake up to, it's almost like a guy who has a little fruit shop in a neighborhood in the 1950s and the neighborhood's changing and he doesn't realize what's going on. He's still selling, the same fruit and he's got subways and airplanes and massive skyscrapers all around him. Mm-hmm. It sounds like we're still, in this outmoded model, and we haven't necessarily fully caught up right now. Why if what you're saying makes so much sense? If less than 1% of Israel's GDP is now what accounts for this U.S. aid, and it's significant, I give you that, but it's not 10% or 20% in the 1970s. Why are we not just immediately turning to America saying, thank you so much for your support. Mm-hmm. We no longer need charity, which is what this really is. We want to go into partnership. Why not start it tomorrow?
Mm-hmm. Well, first of all, these things have been sort of locked in, and most of the current 10-year MOU, most of those funds have been given. Of course, we were fighting a war for the past 2 years. This was a very significant economic burden. Israel, as it is, invests somewhere between 4 or 5% of its GDP in security, which is one of the highest amongst Western advanced countries, and so Israel does have a very significant economic security burden, right? Especially over the last 2 years. It's also going to continue needed in order to rebuild the IDF after having used up a lot of its power, used wear and tear on its across its branches. So it's going to have also in the near future a very significant economic military burden to rebuild, and of course rebuild up the parts of the IDF that had been sort of allowed to ossify over the last 20 years as well. So we're looking at an outlook of very significant investment. And so that's one reason. Also, we were really busy just trying to not lose the war over the last 2 years, and now sort of like the cards are starting to fall, and we're able to really reassess and take a look at the next step. Of course, the current MOU is going to be done in 2028, so a lot of this has sort of been set in already, and now is the time. And these are big questions and big deals. They need to be discussed between both executive branches in detail, come to sort of new agreements that are also long-term, that, might not sort of, change from, 180 degrees from one side to the other. We need to put ourselves on a track for a new model and implement it, having, with a dialogue with the United States in a way that maintains the positive elements of the current cooperation, while you sort of renovates the elements that are grants and charity are maybe not necessary, or just out of date, right? And so I think that's something that is understood. I think it's understood, like I said, very more so now than ever before, both across the the bureaucracy and the security establishment, and among Israel's political leadership. And you can see this. This is obviously is not me saying it. There's been reports recently. Both of Israel's ambassador to the United States has said something along these lines in the last few weeks. There's been reports of the last few weeks also quoting Ron Dermer speaking in this direction. And obviously, this goes hand in hand with the U.S. administration's priorities. So I do think that the time has come to have a new model. I also think that it's up to Israel now to sort of initiate this and move it forward, while we also have a U.S. administration who is fundamentally pro-Israel and wants to see a strong Israel as well, even though it also wants to see it being more independent. I think now is the time to come and initiate and rework this model before maybe 4 years from now, we'll have a different attitude in Congress, in the White House, and maybe we won't have the same opportunities to sort of remake the model in a positive, mutually beneficial framework.
We saw the first time, the first Trump administration, Israel received a lot of gifts. We had a lot of gifts, military gifts and aid and partnership. And then as soon as the Biden administration came in, we could see how very, very quickly, even though it didn't happen right away, but how if the president of the United States turns off that faucet, all of a sudden we find ourselves, in fact, it had already been turned off before October 7th, right? We were missing critical military armaments here, but we could see how very quickly all those gifts kind of evaporated and we were left high and dry. Mm. With this administration, I want to drill down to this just for 1 minute. We could either continue receiving gifts or shape an MOU, just like you're saying, from a president that wants an independent Israeli ally in the Middle East. Again, he sees it. I don't know why everyone doesn't see it in the U.S. We took out the Iraq nuclear reactor, possibly preventing a nuclear war. We just took out Iran for 11 and a half days until the U.S. came in, and I'm very thankful they did for the last 12 hours and dropped a number of buster bombs, but we had bunker busters, but we had already softened up and eliminated a lot of their anti-missile defense at enormous risk. If he gets it, and this is the time for the MOU, give me a few ingredients in that recipe that you think should be in there.
Okay. So one of them is the idea of gradualness, meaning I think it would be best to have a phase out, but rather than a cliff. This is just because, as a sort of a drug addict, it's better off to, wean him off than to have it just stop the processes of both Israel, the IDF's purchases that are already in place, in the 5 to 10 year outlook, and the way that the system has sort of been operating need to shift. They need to change. And if we want to do this in a way that strengthens Israel and also puts it on a course toward independence, I think it would be better if it was done gradually. Right. And so that's sort of one element. The most important part, though, is that whatever it is, if it's 5 years or 10 years or whatever, it needs to be clear and written in that the grants are going to be zero by the end of that period. That's the most critical part. If there's a transition, fine, that's sort of tactics in some ways. That's sort of the overall framework. Now, what else needs to be done? Right. So we could also have an agreement for mutual priority resupply for various things that obviously what the United States currently gives Israel or allows it to purchase with the coupons, it also gives it priority supply. And so we should maintain that. That's just a political decision, right? And there's no reason for that. And also in exchange, under the context of a mutual model, there are various systems that Israel is selling to the United States, so it should be written as a mutual guarantee of priority resupply for whatever systems that we're purchasing. It's not as big as the jet fighter platforms, but there are various elements and equipment that Israel is sending to the United States. It should commit to also guaranteeing those. We should also expand on the current framework of that is the BMD, the missile defense framework, that is already more of a mutual framework where the United States does put in more money, but it's putting in and as an investment into, again, it's things that are mutually developed, mostly by Israel and mutual co-produced, but mostly co-produced in the United States, right? And so that is a framework that might be able to be copied to a number of different elements that Israel has a relative advantage in. This is, cybersecurity, new types of BMD like laser development, perhaps.
Ballistic missile defense.
BMD, ballistic missile defense. Quantum, AI, all of those kinds of things on a tech level. All of these we could have similar sort of cooperative, funds that there would be a clear return on investment for whatever American money that was being put into them, and it would also help Israel fund and provide it with funding to do what it's good at, which is innovating and coming up with new ideas and new technology. Right. And so that could also be good. You could also have, there's a limit to that as well, because certain things that Israel wants to develop itself, it wants to do it on its own and not share the IP necessarily, because then you're dependent on approval to sell to third parties. I want Israel to expand its exports, its defense exports. And there are various things that maybe could be done in order to facilitate that. So I think this is also a very mutually beneficial avenue that Israel will look to how it can help U.S. allies in other parts of the world by helping it, by selling it new technologies that they may need, right? We were talking in East Asia, right? And U.S. Allies in East Asia that could use Israeli know-how and defense technology, that Israel would also be happy to expand and sell it, that type of technology.
So this is a way for Israel to supply and train other armies in the world.
Other armies, U.S. allies around the world.
U.S. allies around the world. It actually saves the U.S. from having to go into those areas, right? We're strengthening the whole ally concept.
Absolutely.
Both in Europe as well.
Yeah, meaning not just Israel being a stronger ally in the Middle East, but Israel integrating into the U.S.'s broader strategic priorities, right? In a way that assists that, but it also opens up new markets for Israeli exports, which will also bring in more income, which allows to sort of win ourselves off and replace the money that we need to invest on our own money because we're going to be purchasing our own equipment.
I want to throw one thing at you today. It was before we began this. I sent you this article that all of a sudden today Israel announced, the defense ministry announced that it's going to be buying M4 assault rifles from the U.S. And it's the same defense ministry that 2 years ago in December 2023, after the war began, said, we're done kind of buying these assault rifles from the U.S. We have to really fund domestic production of not these large platforms, not airplanes and not extremely complicated stuff, but bullets, bombs, weapons. If we're still doing it and we're making this decision now, and it's 2025, and we're already kind of peeling back that kind of assertion, okay, we need to be independent. No, we're going to go back to buying from the U.S. What's happening here? Is this a psychological issue? Is it a practical issue? Why can't we, or will we be able to move forward with what you're saying, Rafael?
I think whatever the certain small deals on firearms was sent, that's not big. The big numbers, it's not big. The big money there. What Israel is doing, it has already made a decision to rebuild its own domestic production of munitions, and it is moving to implementing that. That's a process that takes a year or two, even at the earliest. But I think that's at least in the context of munitions. Let's set aside jet fighter air platforms. It understands Israel, the system, the leadership understands that Israel needs to be independent in that sense, and it's going to do it. In doing so is also one more way of strengthening the mutual elements in the cooperation, because the United States right now understands overall in the world there's a lack of munitions production capability. The United States itself identifies that it's doesn't have as much capability, as much munitions as it would like, especially after sending a lot to the conflict in Ukraine. And so how about this idea? Israel, it's already going to try and produce its own munitions. Well, the limit on that is how much it can supply the IDF with, right? Because there's a certain amount that if it's already sort of resupplied, the IDF is we're going to keep on buying. Of course, to a certain extent, it needs to keep on buying in order to maintain the production lines. But, at some point that's not economically viable. What it should be doing, Israel can be offering to sell its own surplus or a certain amount to the United States, or being sort of part of the U.S.'s overall defense production capacity on a global outlook. It could guarantee you to a certain supply of the United States, and to also selling to other partners, and that way it also serves U.S. broader strategic interests, and it alleviates this economic issue of, okay, if we've already sold the IDF all of its needs, then let's export. Then we can export it and continue on the production lines. Of course, at the moment, we're very far from refilling what is IDF's own needs, but I'm looking at a 5 to 10 year perspective. I think we've gone that direction. I think we should be looking to do that with other, not just munitions, but other elements of Israel's needs.
I want to draw the Truist audience. I want to, draw them to the Miskov website, where you have actually put out some incredible papers on this, Rafael, both in Hebrew but also in English, that are brilliant. In fact, I think maybe President Trump and the Prime Minister read your paper from 2024 when you spoke about Israel's strategic interests and what it would take for the U.S. to really bolster Israel regarding Iran. I think they read your paper. It looked like they implemented it pretty well. So whatever your thoughts are right now, put it in the up and coming paper. Make sure it gets to the same people that you're working on?
Well, I'm working on it, and I do think that this is a time where it's a unique time where we're in a position to remake the relationship in a way that strengthens the relationship between the countries, but also updates it and puts it on a new platform that is the right rebalance.
Rafael, I want to thank you very much. I call you Rafael because you're a dear friend, but Dr. BenLevi, thank you very much for joining us. This was incredibly insightful, and I would love to get you back after your next research comes out, and because I really think that you understand not only practically where Israel needs to be, but in creating self-sufficiency, you also understand Israeli pride. There's a sense of internal pride, not arrogance, pride when we know that we are not accepting gifts or charity, but that we are partners with one of the greatest superpowers around the table. So thank you for giving us not only the practicality, but the spirit of everything that's taking place.
Thanks again, Doron.